Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Re-entry Toolkit Google Hangout. My name is Carlton Mayers, and I am your host. I am the Program Specialist for NAACP National Headquarters. So the purpose of today's Re-entry Toolkit Google Hangout is to discuss and explain the Re-entry Toolkit, which was updated and posted on NAACP's Criminal Justice Resource webpage earlier this year on NAACP's website, which I will show you that link later. The Re-entry Toolkit itself includes information, tools, and other resources which can help in supporting returning citizens who are re-entering society from incarceration. Excuse me. The Re-entry Toolkit itself includes several resources and information which you can find throughout the whole toolkit, and we're going to go into that in more detail later. However, in the wake of injustices, excuse me, such as the Michael Brown shooting in Missouri, the Eric Garner murder in New York City, and other tragedies in Illinois, California, Ohio, Georgia, and etc. There's been more and more attention from the media on the treatment of men and boys of color in the U.S. Hopefully, this means that we are on the verge of seeing a significant change when it comes to how communities of color and the police interact and communicate with each other. But in the meantime, there's a lot of change going on right now when it comes to returning citizens from incarceration and re-entering society. With hundreds of thousands of people leaving incarceration each year, most of which are men and boys of color, communities continue to struggle with challenges by those who have paid their debt to society and still face barriers and collateral consequences that ultimately serve to continue their punishment after they've returned from reincarceration. Like most people, returning citizens want the opportunity to be forgiven for the mistakes that they've made and take back ownership of their lives. In order to be successful in reentry and decrease their chance of recommitting crime and getting reincarcerated, these individuals need an opportunity for redemption, including housing, employment, mental health, substance abuse, and addiction treatment, and other assistance. In light of this, many leaders in both the public and private sectors across the country have made facilitating reentry services for returning citizens a priority. Their successful reentry makes for a stronger community and a stronger economy. And this is where the Re-entry Toolkit plays a very important role. But before I go into this and into the Re-entry Toolkit, I'd like to introduce our special guest today on today's Google Hangout, Dennis Gaddy, who is the Executive Director of Community Success Initiative in Raleigh, North Carolina, and the North Carolina NAACP State Conference Criminal Justice Chair. Hi, Dennis. How are you doing today?
Hello, Carlton. It's good to be here with you this evening and to talk about what I believe to be is one of the very important topics of our time, which is this whole criminal justice and reentry conversation.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, we're very excited to have you here today. I'd like to start off by asking you about the work you do in reentry and what inspired you to do this work.
Well, like I usually tell folks, Carlton, who ask me that question, I didn't come to reentry by accident. I came through this from a very some poor choices I made, and ended up spending 5.5 years in North Carolina Department of Corrections behind those poor choices. Had the good fortune of having a support network on the outside, a wife and children and family and church and community and friends that allowed me to, so to speak, relatively speaking, land on my feet. And so we knew that because of our experiences, and knew that people will hear you different if they know they share, if they know that you share their same experience. We saw that a lot of people who were coming out of incarceration were not as fortunate. So we come to this work out of a sense of obligation to help folks who may not have been so fortunate to have a support network. And the work that we do is to mainly create support networks for people who are coming out of prison and jails in the big 4 areas of jobs and housing and education and human services. And although we may not do all the direct services ourselves, we kind of look at ourselves as directors of traffic to be able to help people get to where they need to be to solve some of the problems they need to solve. So that being one major area of our work is to connect people to direct services and to other services. And the other part of our work is to do legislative advocacy work to help people remove some of the barriers that they're facing when coming out of prison and jails, or who find themselves entangled in the criminal justice systems. And we try to fight the fight at the legislative policy level, and we've been doing that since 2011, where we've had our first Second Chance Lobby Day in North Carolina, along with our Second Chance Alliance. So those two areas pretty much define the work we do. And if there was a third leg, it would be to help identify organizations across the state and agencies across the state who would like to duplicate the work that we do, and we do some coaching and training around that as well. But been on the front lines of this criminal justice, social justice work for the last 10 years now, and that's where we find ourselves these days.
Excellent. Thank you very much. You're doing some really good work, and it seems like it's very beneficial for people returning home from incarceration, and also, very fulfilling, which I also understand. I used to provide direct service work as well for a couple of years, and it was very, very fulfilling. So that's wonderful that you're doing that work. I do want to ask you, what do you think about the Re-entry Toolkit, and how do you think it can apply to the work that you're currently doing?
Well, I'll tell you, Carlton, I really fell in love with the toolkit when I first saw it because of the work we do on the ground with the grassroots work we do, and especially training organizations to do this work. The toolkit saved me a lot of time and saved me a lot of research time because everything was so professionally put together in one document. So when I go across the state and do the training I do, whether it be with grassroots organizations or whether it be with NAACP chapters and branches across the state, I can take a document that is all the same in each place I go. I don't have to change and up and at every stop. This document provides some well-needed training, hitting the hot topics, and also giving some great resources and research that will help a person who's trying to learn how to organize locally. It also helped us very tremendously when we were trying to put together our legislative efforts in order to educate our legislators and also educate the people who will be actually doing the actual lobbying and training at the legislature to be able to know exactly what bullet points to hit and what's important, and kind of be assured that the research is impeccable once we take it to those areas. So the areas of organizing at the local level and also organizing at the legislative level, the toolkit has been very, very important to me in helping me do the work that I do.
Excellent, excellent. So what do you think are the takeaways for other reentry practitioners who were involved in this work?
Well, I don't want to sound redundant, but I think the two areas that I just mentioned are areas that people can be that I think are very important and as takeaways. One being that if a person really wanted to learn how to help give out information at the local level to NAACP branches particularly and other grassroots agencies, that this is a very good tool to be able to do that, and they don't have to worry about the facts being out of place and the numbers not being accurate, those kinds of things. They have very much confidence in the numbers. And then secondly, you can feel very confident in giving it to our legislative people as well, our legislators, our House reps, our Senate reps at the state and national levels, to give them some information about what's going on in this area of criminal justice, especially as it affects African American males and people of color.
Yeah, thank you very much. So now I would like to ask a question from one of our Twitter followers. At J Fierce says, "Society needs action. How does this toolkit make action happen?"
Well, I believe that action needs to be educated action, and this toolkit allows a person to learn the facts before they go into action, so they can be confident that their action is effective and truthful. So I think that a person can feel confident by taking the information learned from the toolkit and actually create some action, and actually makes it easier to duplicate the action because you don't have to worry about trying to learn new things every training. You can just give out the toolkit because it's uniform across the board.
Yeah, I also agree with Dennis, and I'd like to add that the toolkit actually has a resources section toward the end of the toolkit, and we'll discuss that a bit later. But within that section, there's a recommendations and best practices, which is very helpful when it comes to speaking to employers and talking to them about establishing hiring practices for hiring returning citizens, for employing returning citizens, or even if they already have hiring practices in place, amending those hiring practices to make them even more, more efficient and better on both ends for the returning citizen who's applying for the job and for the employer who's looking to hire for the position. And so I know that section would be very helpful for somebody who wants to actually, go into action, like take something from the toolkit and actually push it and move it into action. Another helpful aspect of the toolkit is there's in the resources section as well, there's a section on how to start up your own town hall meeting within your community, where you can actually set up a town hall meeting, invite members from your community to come out and publicize, inform them about the situation with returning citizens. And then that way maybe try to galvanize people to become more active in providing support to people within their own community who are returning from incarceration. So there's definitely a lot. The toolkit is rich with all kinds of resources to help anyone out, any individual in the organization who's trying to turn this this campaign into actual action-driven campaign. So yeah, and Dennis, at this point, I would like to say thank you for joining us on today's Google Hangout.
Thank you for the invitation.
For being our special guest. Yeah, and is there any way that people can contact you to communicate with you about the work you do, or even to learn more about your organization?
Yes, they can contact us actually through our website. Now we're in the period of transition at our office, so let me give you our website, and you can either email us, and our phone number is updated on our website, www.communitysuccess.org. That's www.communitysuccess.org. And they can go there and email us or call us from the website, as well as find out about our work at that website and check us out.
Excellent. Well, Dennis, thank you very much for joining us today on today's Re-entry Toolkit Google Hangout, and have a good day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
All right, take care. Bye-bye. Okay, now we're going to dive into the Re-entry Toolkit with some PowerPoint slides. And yep, so there's the first slide. So I'd like to start off by giving people some information on the NAACP National Criminal Justice Program. As you can see on this next slide, the NAACP National Criminal Justice Program advances the Smart and Safe Criminal Justice Campaign, which consists of 4 priority areas, one being law enforcement and accountability and racial profiling, with a focus on ending racial profiling and increasing law enforcement accountability. Then there's what we're focusing on today, which is successful reentry, and this is focused on removing employment barriers for returning citizens. Next, mass incarceration and sentencing reform, and we have a misplaced priorities report, which was released in 2011, that goes into detail on these issues. You can find that on the Criminal Justice Resource page on NAACP's website, and I will provide you with that link a little later. And then finally is the death penalty, in which our goal is to end the death penalty by 2025. Next slide. So now I'd like to provide some helpful definitions before we go into the toolkit. First, I know you've heard Dennis and I throwing this word around, or this term around a lot, returning citizen. So a returning citizen is any individual who has been convicted of a criminal act and has been discharged from the jurisdiction of the Department of Corrections or any other correctional jurisdiction. Then there's recidivism, which is a tendency to relapse into a previous mode of behavior, especially a relapse into criminal behavior. which results in reincarceration. Next slide. Currently, there are at least 700,000 individuals returning home from prisons and jails every year. That's a substantial number. They face collateral consequences such as loss of public housing benefits, employment barriers, cannot sit on juries, parental rights, and in many states, voting rights. This has been called the new Jim Crow, which refers to the title of Michelle Alexander's book on race in the U.S. and refers to the creation of a new caste in our country, in the U.S. population, who are ostracized from receiving these resources and other resources. Next slide. So the Re-entry Toolkit provides background information on the situation with returning citizens. It consists of an explanation of the Ban the Box campaign, what NAACP leaders can do to advance this cause locally, what NAACP leaders can do to advance reentry at the national level, communicating with national NAACP, and resources. And then you can see at the bottom there, as I promised, there's the link for the NAACP Criminal Justice Resource page on NAACP's website. Now, before I go any further, I'd like to just make clear that even though these titles say what NAACP leaders can do, the Re-entry Toolkit can be applied or be utilized by anybody, any individual, any organization who's interested in pushing forward reentry services, providing them to those in need, or push forward for a second chance campaign. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned earlier, one of the parts of the Re-entry Toolkit is the Ban the Box campaign. Now, the Ban the Box campaign is a nationwide campaign to remove the question from job applications about a person's criminal history or arrest history record. And I'm going to go into more detail, in a minute about that. First, I'd like to talk about what's the problem. So, as I mentioned earlier, as Dennis and I mentioned earlier, the collateral consequences would serve as the continued punishment that returning citizens faced after paying their debt to society. Now, this is very apparent when it comes to employment. For instance, liability involved in hiring a returning citizen can cause employers to be biased and concerned. Under state law doctrines of negligent hiring and retention, employers can be held liable liable to victims injured by an employee if the employer knew or should have known that its employee might do harm to another. This knowledge sometimes can be established by the fact that the employee who caused the injury had a criminal conviction. For a lot of employers, this makes hiring returning citizens a burden. And this leads to the next problem, criminal background checks. Many employers have easy access to applicants' criminal histories and may consider an applicant's conviction record, and in some cases, a person's arrest record. Employers cannot discriminate against individuals solely on the basis of possessing a criminal record. However, they can refuse to hire if an employer can show that a returning citizen's background will negatively affect the employer's workplace and business. While workplace security should always be a concern, employers have instituted a number of practices that unfairly and unnecessarily discriminate against and deny individuals with unrelated conviction histories an opportunity to work. So the Re-entry Toolkit also includes facts such as an estimated 65 million Americans have criminal records. That's a lot. African Americans make up roughly 13% of the U.S. population, but are only 40% of its prisoners. Employed individuals are 1/3 less likely than their counterparts to recommit crime and are more likely to turn their lives around for good. Now, then there's also the solution, and this is displayed in the next slide. The Ban the Box campaign, as I mentioned earlier briefly. So like I said earlier, the Ban the Box campaign is a nationwide campaign to remove the question from job applications asking a person about their criminal history and arrest history record. Now, instead of having that question asked at the beginning of the job application, Instead, which would then prevent discrimination by employers of a person who's applying for a job and has a criminal history record. The employer can look at that person's application, see if they have the skills, the talent, the expertise that's required for the job, and then if they do, if they qualify, provide them with an interview, in-person interview, where they can then meet that individual, get to know their personality, see if they'd be a good fit for their workplace, and if so, at that point, provide them with a conditional offer that'll be based on a background check. Now, even if the person has a criminal history record and they go through the background check and that comes up, the employer would, under the Ban the Box campaign, the employer would provide that person with an opportunity to explain their criminal history record and also provide them with an opportunity to provide evidence of rehabilitation, such as certificates from, let's say, conflict management skills classes, anger management skills classes, workplace etiquette classes, or even GED classes. Also recommendations from ex-employers, work release coordinators, case managers, etc. And so the Ban the Box campaign is nationwide, and you can also find it, we'll talk about that a bit later, in the local arena as well. Next slide, please. Another solution is that corporate and government employers should strengthen anti-discrimination policy by making it illegal to exclude based solely on arrest and conviction history, by following the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission guidelines, which state that there should be no blanket bans on individuals with criminal records, and give individuals a chance to explain their criminal records when it comes up in a background check. Now, there are also federal government programs that provide reassurance to employers who, might be considering hiring somebody who has a criminal history record. For instance, there's the federal bonding program, which is run through the U.S. Department of Labor. Now, this program involves fidelity bonds being issued to an employer free of charge for at-risk employees or employees whose past experiences present an obstacle to future employment. Fidelity bonding is pretty much insurance purchased to pay back employers for loss of money or property sustained through the dishonest acts of their employees, for example, theft, forgery, larceny, embezzlement, and they will receive money back in the amount of usually $5,000 with no deductible amount of liability for the employer. Higher amounts of coverage of up to $25,000 may be allowed if justified. The bond does not cover liability, however, due to poor workmanship, job injuries, or work accidents. So, very important point. This is free for the employer, and it goes into effect the first day of the job applicant's employment, and will terminate after 6 months. And once the 6 months is over, if the employer still wants to bond the individual, they can then purchase a bond for that. This program is successful with over 42,000 job placements made for at-risk job seekers who are automatically made bondable. That's excellent. The next program is the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, which is run through the Internal Revenue Service, or as we know, the IRS. And this is a federal tax credit available to employers for hiring individuals from certain target groups who have consistently faced significant barriers to employment, for instance, returning citizens. Employers receive a tax credit for that taxable year for $2,400 per eligible employee hire. So now I'd like to go to there are government programs out there, and if you're an advocate, this could be helpful if you want to speak to employers and try to woo them more in favor of hiring returning citizens for jobs that they have available. Let them know about these incentives where they can make some money for hiring people who are at risk. Next slide. So, what NAACP leaders can do to advance this cause locally? That's the next section. And for instance, create and join reentry councils or coalitions. These are publicly funded or community organizations that are formed by members in the community, and they focus on reentry issues going on in that particular community. Then there's also provide direct services, for instance, conflict management for relationships, mentoring, job placement for employment, transitional housing for housing, etc. And then advocate for hiring returning citizens. And I'm going to go into the recommendations and best practices section a little later, but that would definitely tie into that part. Advocate for policy change and advocate for voting rights of returning citizens. Now, I just want to stress with you that these are all to be focused on the local and state level. So next slide. Now, what NAACP leaders can do to advance reentry at the national level. This is focusing more on felony disenfranchisement. It has to do with returning citizens losing the right to vote after leaving incarceration. And I have some information I want to give you on that. So, for instance, over 5.8 million Americans are not allowed to vote because they have been convicted of a felony, regardless of the nature or seriousness of the offense. More than 1/3 of these people are African Americans, and while the laws vary from state to state, in some states, including Florida, Kentucky, and Virginia, more than 1 in 5 African Americans have lost the right to vote. That's a very significant number. Now, there's also more facts in this section of the toolkit that will give you more information on this particular issue. There's also information on voter suppression tactics, which is also a hot topic right now, looking at the changes going on with the Voting Rights Act. And then there's a section on action that you can take, and this includes written letters to your Congress members in support of legislation to restore the rights of returning citizens, such as the Democracy Restoration Act of 2014 and legislation to allow the federal government to subsidize reentry direct services, such as the Second Chance Act. Next slide. Now, these are the last two sections of the Re-entry Toolkit, communicating with national NAACP and resources. So communicating with national NAACP, there's a section there called Let Us Know What You're Working On letter. Now, this is primarily focused on, geared towards members of the NAACP and the branches and state conferences. This is for them to utilize. However, the other sections being NAACP recommendations and best practices, resources on the web, government programs to support hiring individuals with criminal records, such as the federal bonding program, the work opportunity tax credit, and liabilities and incentives for employers. Those other sections can be utilized by any organization or any individual who's interested in providing reentry services in their community. Next slide. So now I would like to talk about how the Re-entry Toolkit is applicable to what's currently occurring on Capitol Hill through executive and legislative efforts. For instance, there's the Clemency Project 2014. So under U.S. law, the president can grant clemency for federal crimes by reducing sentences or pardoning Americans serving sentences. Under the leadership of Attorney General Eric Holder, recently the Justice Department has widened the criteria it uses to decide which drug defenders to recommend to the president for clemency. The new clemency criteria aimed at freeing potentially thousands of prisoners convicted of nonviolent, low-level drug offenses. The Justice Department has assigned dozens of lawyers to its pardon attorney's office to review an influx of applications. Recently, the numbers said that the DOJ has received, the Department of Justice has received at least 18,000 petitions, and right now they're estimating another 18,000 going into the new year, which is a very, very substantial number. And these are petitions from people who are currently serving time in federal prison right now. So that's 18 to 36,000 people who might be potentially coming back home going into the new year. Granting clemency to nonviolent offenders is part of the Obama administration's strategy to reduce spending on federal prisons by reducing the number of inmates serving time for nonviolent drug crimes. Last year, Holder launched the Smart on Crime initiative to review the criminal justice system and look for ways to make spending on prisons more efficient by focusing on violent offenders. And Matter of fact, in December of last year, Obama granted clemency to 8 such people. So I just want to stress how important the Re-entry Toolkit is going to be, especially going into the new year when you have anywhere from 18 to 36,000 people at least who might be returning home to their communities, to your community, and they're going to have issues with getting employment. They're going to have issues with receiving public assistance, receiving housing. That's a lot of people to be out here with no assistance. And this is where the Re-entry Toolkit really comes in handy, because it gives you the information and the resources you need to provide them with that assistance, or if anything, to at least lead them in the right direction, guide them in the right direction for help. Next slide. Oh, and on this slide, on the last slide, I also want to stress that you saw the list of the 6 criteria that have been widened for the clemency of federal inmates. There's one in there that I underlined that I really want to stress, which is that they have served at least 10 years of their sentence. The reason why I want to stress that is because you're talking about anywhere from 18 to 36,000 people who have been locked up for at least 10 years. And research has shown that when a person is incarcerated for a long period of time, it's really difficult for them to reincorporate and adapt back into society once they're released. So once again, I just want to stress the need for the Re-entry Toolkit, especially going into the new year, with providing support to people re-entering society from incarceration. Next slide. Now, currently there is the REDEEM Act, and it looks like the slide might be down temporarily, but oh, there we go. Sorry about that. There's the REDEEM Act, which is the Record Expungement Designed to Enhance Employment Act. Now, this act was introduced by 2 freshman senators, one being Democrat Cory Booker of New Jersey, and the other being Republican Rand Paul of Kentucky. They have teamed up for a bipartisan effort to introduce a comprehensive overhaul of the nation's criminal justice system that they say will cut government spending and help make it easier for nonviolent criminals to eventually secure a job. Now, the REDEEM Act, as you can see on the slide, creates a federal sealing pathway for nonviolent adult returning citizens, automatically seals and in some cases expunges juvenile records, and it also updates and the FBI background check system and improves upon it and its accuracy. And this is the most important part that I want to talk about. It lifts the lifetime SNAP and TANF bans on many nonviolent drug offenders. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with SNAP and TANF, those are 2 federal public assistance programs, or federal government public assistance programs, which provide assistance to people who are living below the poverty line. Now, I know from personal experience, I used to provide direct services to incarcerants and returning citizens, and most people who are in that kind of circumstance are living below the poverty line, and definitely coming out of incarceration, they need that kind of assistance. And I've been told by incarcerants that if they're not able to find assistance, a job, housing, whatever they need to take care of themselves, and a lot of times their families, more than likely they're going to go back to committing crime, because they can make a lot of money in a very short period of time and be able to take care of themselves and those they care about. So I'm very happy that Senator Cory Booker and Rand Paul are pushing for this, because there's definitely a significant need. All right, next slide. And here they are, the political odd couple, Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky and Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey. Next slide. So now I just want to briefly end by talking about the Drugs Minus 2 law, which pertains to the U.S. sentencing guidelines. So U.S. sentencing guidelines are recommended rules for judges to follow when determining a sentence in federal court. The guidelines look at the facts that led to the conviction. In the case of drugs, the guidelines look at 2 factors to come up with a starting point, one being the type of drug and the next being the quantity of the drugs. Drugs Minus 2 law, also known as Amendment 782, reduces the sentencing guidelines by 2 levels for all controlled substances across the board on the sentencing guideline table. This means that the sentencing guidelines will advise judges to start the job of calculating a sentence 2 levels below the current recommended sentence. As a result, more drug defendants will receive shorter sentences for nonviolent low-level drug offenses in federal court. Now that's great news, but even better news, in addition, the U.S. Sentencing Commission recently voted unanimously sentencing guidelines retroactive so that this amendment applies to federal inmates currently serving time whose guideline sentence was based on some quantity of any controlled substance. Now this does not have anything to do with statutory and mandatory minimums. If somebody was sentenced under a mandatory minimum, they still have to go through that process. However, if it was through a guideline quantity calculation that the sentence is based on, in that case, with this new law, the sentence could be reduced significantly. So approximately 70% of drug defendants subject to the sentencing guidelines will be affected by drugs -2. And the Sentencing Commission is expecting at least 50,000 inmates to be eligible to have their sentences shortened due to the retroactivity of this amendment. Now this law is enacted and begins as of November of this year, so it is literally right around the corner. So I just want to say, looking at the Clemency Project 2014, and then also looking at the drugs -2 law, I mean, you're talking about anywhere from 36 to potentially 50,000, maybe 86,000 people, maybe more, maybe a little less, but that's a significant number of people returning home from spending a long time incarcerated. And they're going to need support, they're going to need help, and this Re-entry Toolkit has what it takes to help them, and has whatever you need to help them. So I just want to stress that. Next slide. So as you can see, I have the HOPE sign up. So there is hope for returning citizens to satisfy their time in incarceration, return to their communities, and not have to face collateral consequences after their release, but instead being given a well-deserved second chance to contribute to their families, to their communities, and to society as a whole in a constructive and a positive way. Now on that note, I'd like to wrap up today's Re-entry Toolkit Google Hangout. There's another slide here that's next. And I just want to just give you a few takeaways. One being a few takeaways from the Re-entry Toolkit. One being advocating for employment of returning citizens, as I mentioned earlier, in the resources section especially. There's a lot of information in the recommendations and best practices section that has to do with what you can do to work with employers on establishing hiring practices for employing returning citizens, or helping to make those hiring practices even better and more efficient. There's also information in the toolkit, as I mentioned as well, on the Ban the Box campaign, on how you can start your own Ban the Box campaign in your community, or get involved with one on the state level and also on the national level. Then there's advocating for restoring voting rights of returning citizens. And like I mentioned, we talked about felony disenfranchisement. There's a lot of information in that section. And then publicizing the situation of returning citizens. And for this one, like I mentioned earlier, with the resources section, there's a lot of information on, like for instance, how to create a town hall meeting and get people galvanized, get people excited in your community to do this kind of work. We also provide PSAs, or public service announcements, that can be used on the radio or in local publications to announce a local town hall meeting. But we have all that information in there in detail. Please check it out, as you can see at the bottom, at this link, which is the Criminal Justice Resource page for for NAACP, and on the NAACP website. And last slide, please. And keep in touch. My name is Carlton T. Mears II, Esquire. I'm the Program Specialist at NAACP Criminal Justice Department. Any questions you have about today's Re-entry Toolkit Google Hangout, you can direct to hashtag NAACPCJ, or you can contact me on Twitter at my handle, which is @CTMayers2. And then you can also, if you if you're not able to do the other options, you also have the option of emailing my department and myself at reentry@naacpnet.org. So I just want to say thank you once again to Dennis Gaddy for being our special guest today on today's Re-entry Toolkit Google Hangout. We are planning on having more Re-entry Toolkit Google Hangouts with other guests coming on who work in the reentry field, and we'll talk about the work they do in different aspects of providing reentry services. And I also want to say especially a thank you to those of you who've watched today's episode or watched today's Hangout and are interested in helping to raise awareness about reentry and reentry services. Thank you, and good night and goodbye.